Hello, everyone, and welcome to another series in my videos on law practice experiences in the legal profession. Today we have a unique topic about legal clerkships. It's a topic that oftentimes students have a lot of questions about. Should I apply for a clerkship? Is it worth doing? What are the positives and negatives of doing so? Today I'm joined by two individuals who will hopefully shed some light on that. First of all, I'm joined by Ben Kapnik, who is currently Assistant Attorney General in Colorado. Ben clerked for the 10th Circuit a few years ago. And I'm also here with Stephanie Barclay, who is an Associate Professor of Law at Notre Dame Law School. She clerked for the 9th Circuit a few years ago. So both of them have some unique perspectives on their experience, and I'm glad to have both of you here with me today. Thanks, Stephanie and Ben, for joining me.
Thank you.
Great to be with you.
So let's start first with backgrounds. Let's lay the foundation so that students have an idea about where you're coming from and how you got here. So I'd like to begin with Stephanie. Would you mind telling us where you went to undergrad, where you went to law school, the trajectory that's got you to where you are right now? And we'll talk a little bit later about your decision to go to law school and so forth, but for right now, just your background should suffice.
Sure. I went to BYU, Idaho for my undergrad, and Adam, I had the fine opportunity of being in a class with you in undergrad where you made me look really bad because you're so smart and awesome, but that's okay. So I enjoyed doing that, and then I went to law school at BYU, clerked on the 9th Circuit, worked in private practice in DC for a few years, and then I went into academia. So that's my trajectory.
Awesome. And Ben, what got you to the Attorney General's office?
Yeah, I went to a small school in Denver for undergrad, the Metropolitan State College of Denver. It's actually now Metropolitan State University. And then after that, went to GW Law in DC, where I got to similarly be shown up by Adam. And then went to the 10th Circuit, clerked for a year there, clerked briefly with filling in for another judge, was in private practice for a couple of years, and then moved over to the AG's office.
Awesome. Well, so I want to launch right into the benefits of clerking, the reasons why people clerk. So why don't we start with just a pretty basic question. In terms of the things that you two could have done in law school and in terms of the directions that your career could have gone, why did both of you choose personally to become clerks? And you can, give us individual perspectives on that. It doesn't necessarily have to be, why are clerkships better than not clerkships, but what drew both of you to clerking? Why don't we go with Ben first, and then we'll talk to Stephanie.
I think for me, it was a lot of folks that I really trusted suggested very strongly that it was a great way to start a legal career. More than a few people said it would be the most fun year that you'd have after law school. So I wanted to give it a shot if it would work out.
Was it a pretty fun year for you, Ben?
It was. I mean, it's a really cool experience. And I think both getting to be with co-clerks who are all invested, brilliant people, and getting to sort of bounce ideas around and talk about nerdy legal issues, things that I enjoy.
That's great. And Stephanie, what drew you to clerking when you were in law school?
So I almost didn't clerk because I thought, that's an extra year of time, and I've already been in school for a while, and I really need to start real life. And I'm so grateful and feel very fortunate that I had mentors who explained to me what an incredible opportunity clerking would be, and how it was an investment, certainly, of that year of my life when I potentially could have been making more money or starting to put roots down. But it was an investment really well spent that I would absolutely do again. So, and similar to Ben, it was from advice of others, thinking about both how that sort of credential can open doors for you. Certainly not the only way to have some of those doors open, but it is often a very effective way to open some important doors in your career. It's a chance for you to see inside and sort of behind the curtain of how the judiciary operates and how judges make decisions, and what's persuasive to them, what which advocates are doing a good job and which aren't. It's a chance to really hone your writing as you're working with a very experienced mentor and jurist who is this judge. And the fact that you will often then get to have this judge as a friend and mentor for the rest of your career, and on both for professional reasons and personal reasons, I think I underestimated how valuable that would be, to have that sort of person with that expertise and those sorts of connections just in your corner trying to help you be successful. So I'm sure we'll talk about more of that, but the bottom line is I almost didn't, and I'm so glad I did. And for students who may not be thinking of it as a realistic expectation, something that they even want to consider, I just encourage them to pause and think a little bit harder about if they want to explore that route or not.
That's awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. So in terms of the steps to getting there, we'll talk in a minute about the actual work experience, but one question that I think students would have is, what does the application process look like? I mean, it's very intimidating to think about, applying to work with a judge, especially since you're a law student who is not yet barred and does not yet have experience actually practicing law. So both of you are on the federal bench, so obviously the application process is unique to that, but can you speak to, what the steps are? What's it like in law school selecting where you'd like to clerk? What's the process like? What are some support systems that are usually at law schools to get you there along the way? Why don't we go with Stephanie first, and then we'll go back to Ben.
So the short answer is that it is an opaque process that is confusing, and that different judges have wildly different systems for, as far as how that application process works, what the timeline is, what they're looking for. There are some common denominators, and I'll talk about those, but because it is not terribly transparent and there's a lot of variety, there's some principles that are going to be important for you to try and navigate this process. And so one is to get to know your professors and ask them about this. If you're speaking up and participating in class, or offering to do research or be a TA for their professor, or just visiting with them in office hours, these are good opportunities for them to start to get to know you, and for you to start to ask questions that your professors will have a lot more insight into that process than you do. Second, go talk to your career services office. They often have charts and handouts that will tell you timelines, and which judge is using what's called an Oscar system, and which judge just likes things to be sent directly to their office, or likes electronic copies. Those things all vary. And then often law schools have a clerkship committee or clerkship panels. You should figure out who is on that panel or in that group, and get to know them and let them know, I'm interested. What materials do you have? What should I be thinking about now? So step number one is just plug into those groups, because they will have the best information for you. As far as how the process itself goes, it's helpful to be thinking about creating, when you get into law school, some sort of legal writing sample that you can use to get feedback on your resume so that it looks polished. There's some guidelines for how to do a short, concise, but professional cover letter that is going to look a little different when you're writing to a judge. And then beyond that, usually judges are looking for 2 to 3, sometimes 4 letters of recommendation, often from a professor, but you can also sometimes have one, or at most 2, I would say, from a supervisor if you've done like a legal internship or something like that. So those are some of the common denominators that often come up, but talking to the right folks to understand more of the variation and who they might have some connections with amongst these judges that could be really helpful for you is going to be much more valuable than just knowing what the general rules of thumb are.
Great. Ben, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really.
Great.
That was it.
All right. So one thing that I think students oftentimes are concerned with, and Stephanie, you flagged this at the very beginning, and that is, well, wait a minute, I've got to set aside a year of my life working for a judge. I'm not going to be actually practicing law in the strict sense. It's going to make me less money during that year. So why would I go through this process? Why would I actually go about this? Why don't we talk a little bit about the pros and the cons? Stephanie, you flagged a few of them for us, but Ben, why don't you go ahead and start on this topic? Why would a student want to deviate for a year potentially go to some far-flung part of the United States to work on some federal district court. Why would I want to go do that?
I mean, I actually think Stephanie hit a lot of it really well. It is a quite amazing opportunity, I think, in a couple of different ways. One is it's a huge learning opportunity, as Stephanie was referencing, getting to sort of peek behind the curtain a little bit into the judiciary, getting the relationships both with a judge, someone who is really risen within the field and has a lot of insight, and to be able to work with them. Getting, as I referenced earlier, co-clerks, I think, can be an amazing piece of it as well. A lot of judges basically have families of previous clerks, and there can be networks throughout the country, or at least in that area of those folks. I mean, my son, the judges call them his grand clerk, and just that type of relationship, I think, can be really special.
Yeah, my judge called my kids his grand clerks too, so it's very cute.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Ben, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
No, I mean, I really do think Stephanie hit a lot of it, and it's a cool way to see, if you end up going somewhere that is home or that you want to go, great. And if not, I think it can be a really cool way to have a nice set chunk of time to see a different part of the country.
Yeah. Stephanie, did you have any more insight on this? I mean, one question just to add to this topic a little bit. Sometimes, I hear from prospective law students and law students themselves who will say, well, I'm going to be a practitioner someday. I mean, other than, learning how judicial opinions are written, how will this have some demonstrable impact on my ability to be a good practitioner when I could spend that year, actually gaining real experience?
Yeah, so I do hear students ask that question sometimes. And one of the most important things I would say about that, especially if you want to do any sort of litigation, but certainly not limited to that. But let's just say that you're a practitioner who wants to litigate. Your audience, to be a successful practitioner, are judges. You are trying to persuade judges to rule in your favor. And having more insight into how judges are thinking and what is more likely to be persuasive to them is going to, in the long run, let you be more successful for your clients and in your career as a practitioner. Sometimes having a clerkship will also open up doors for you that will make you a better practitioner. So there may be some clients who will say, I want someone litigating this case who has a clerkship. There may be some partners who say, we're going to put a person on this deposition or working on this hearing if they have a clerkship. So you will have opportunities to get more substantive, meaty, sometimes exciting opportunities because of that credential. So all of those things just sort of jumpstart and accelerate ways in which you can be successful as a practitioner.
That's really great. That's a good thing to bring out for students, especially because oftentimes students at this stage as undergrads have very little benchmarks to judge against all this. So, being able to be open-minded about the possibility of whether it be federal or state judicial clerkships is a really good thing. So one other thing too, that especially on the federal bench sometimes comes up, is that students will say, well, it's just so political, right? I'm a liberal. I better only apply to what are so-called the liberal justices, or vice versa. How have you two navigated that? Sometimes students think that every layer of the judiciary is just like the Supreme Court, where everybody's, picking their battle lines. How would you respond to that concern? Stephanie, why don't you go first on this, and then and Ben, you can add any input.
Even though this isn't what you hear about in the media, the truth is that most judicial opinions are unanimous. And it was a real privilege for me to work on cases where judges with very different views about a lot of things would come together and say, well, this is how the law works, and we're going to get this done and perform this important public service for our country. On top of that, there's a lot of judges that aren't as focused on some of those issues you were talking about, Adam, as far as like being really partisan. Most aren't. And so my judge, for example, deliberately tried to hire so that he had diversity of views in his chamber, because he wanted his clerks to debate with each other and to debate with him And I really benefited from that. And I think he often felt like he benefited from that too, so that he was more likely to get to the right answer. I think that often happens in terms of hiring. I'll also say, I think a lot of judges, certainly mine, really demonstrated for me and set the example of learning how to disagree respectfully and without rancor, even when it did come to some of those issues where you might have a different view. There was one particular case where we were dissenting and the other judge was writing the majority opinion, and we had traded drafts back and forth, and it got a little heated, and the clerk in the other chambers wrote us an email that was sort of snippy, I guess, if I'll use that description. And I typed up a pretty snippy email back, and I gave the draft to my judge and said, why don't we send this back? And I was sort of fired up, and he said, you know, I can understand why you feel that way, and you're probably right, but we're not going to send that email. And he helped craft a very respectful, kind email back, where we were sort of like, you know, recognizing their position and saying what else we could do to address some of their concerns. And the judge in those chambers actually called my judge and said, you know what, that email we sent wasn't very kind, and your response was, and it meant a lot to me, and we shouldn't have sent that email. And I'll always remember that example. That I think judges said a lot of the times when they have to sometimes disagree, and less often than the media suggests, but they can do so in a way where they're still colleagues and friends, and they still admire each other. And I think we need more of that in this country.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to bring out, especially from the perspective of gaining real skills. Sometimes students who immediately go into practice develop a lot of those bad habits of being really snarky to other individuals. And as you point out, it's a great opportunity to gain some professionalism skills. Ben, what are your insights? What are some things that you saw as far as the political nature of the judiciary? Did it really have much of an effect on your clerking?
No, it really didn't. And I think, you know, just adding on to Stephanie's point, that I think a lot of judges intentionally seek out people that are not necessarily like them, but I think there's also an understanding that they want clerks who are willing to clerk for judges with different viewpoints. That if a clerk applicant was only willing to apply to work with certain judges, I think that there are judges who would see that as a red flag, because it, you know, for them, I think overwhelmingly it's about getting the law right and not about getting the law in a specific way.
That's great. Well, and especially in the case of district court judges, where oftentimes these more what we would call media-driven political ideas are really not lurking above the surface. It's more about building the facts, looking at the evidence, building the record, and so forth. So working for a district court judge, it's very unlikely that you have those kinds of experiences anyway. Let me also ask this question before we turn to what I would call the last two maybe important questions. And actually, I'll take those last two questions and combine them because they're very similar. But let me first ask this one because it's oftentimes on students' minds. What's the work-life balance like for a federal clerk? You hear horror stories on different forms of practice about how a person can be at their desk for 90-hour weeks. What's it like for a clerk during that year? Ben, why don't we go with you first, and then we'll go with Stephanie.
Honestly, I think this is something that really depends on the judge and the chambers and a number of different factors that might be out of a judge's control. Large parts of my clerkship time were pretty reasonable work-life balance. I mean, it certainly flares, and there are, I think anything in a litigation world has a certain level of unpredictability, even though I think there's a little bit more on the judicial side of ability to control some of that. But you certainly hear about clerks who are working a lot. And I don't know, Stephanie, if what your experience was like.
I agree that it's very judge specific. That said, I think on average, it is less stressful, and you're probably going to work a lower amount of hours, or at least feel less stressed when you're doing it than at a lot of private practice jobs at a big law firm. Here's why. When you are working for your judge and your clerkship, you have essentially one client. And that client, they may be demanding, they may be rigorous, but still at the end of the day, your judge, him or her will know everything that you have on your plate, and they're not going to give you conflicting instructions. And they do have some sense in their mind of the fact that there are only 24 hours in the day, and probably don't expect you to pull all-nighters every single one of them, right? When you're in private practice, you have many clients, and they don't know what the other client is asking of you. And even if you're not immediately talking to the clients themselves, you might be working for multiple partners. And so it's going to be up to you a lot more to police the boundaries of your time and try and balance a lot of different competing demands. Whereas when you're clerking, you've really just got one job, and that is do the analysis and the work that your judge is asking you to do. It can be intense, as Ben said, I think with just about any job, and certainly with legal jobs, there are going to be peaks and valleys, right? There will be pockets of intensity and other portions that are going to be times when you can recharge a little bit more. And I found that there were certainly some very intense pockets, and sometimes I was the one making it intense because I really cared. And when we worked on a death penalty issue, I knew that the stakes were very high, and I wanted to get it right for that individual. So it's not even that my judge was saying, I need you to work every night until midnight. Like I wanted to do that, right? But there were also plenty of times where I was going home at 5 p.m. and having a lovely dinner with my family. And I think that the peaks were lower in my clerkship, and the valleys were more frequent than they will be starting out in private practice. So it's often a time to enjoy that too when you're on your clerkship.
That's great. That's a good thing to bring out, that maybe it's a nice, entry point into the legal practice, building up your resolve and your stamina for what might be to come. All right, well, let me end with this question, and this is a typical question that you'd probably get in any one of these panels, but it's one that I really, really value, especially for students who are trying to decide whether they want to go to law school. So hearing other voices besides mine is really crucial for them. So this is the question I have for you. What ultimately would you say to undergrads that are preparing for law school? What tips would you have? Or maybe put this another way, if you could go back in time and you could talk to yourself before you entered law school, what are some things that you wish you would have known? And now in hindsight, you wish you would have been able to tell yourself? Let's go Ben first, and then we'll go Stephanie.
I think a couple of things. One, it's a really fun place to, I think, connect with people, really smart people who are interested in similar things, and to the extent that you're going, look for that and enjoy that. I do think that it's important to be aware that you're going into an environment where, most classes are one test per class, and there's a certain level of preparation that you need to be willing to do all the way through the semester to get there, depending on what you want to do. And certainly if you want to go to a place like clerking on the Ninth Circuit, I don't think you can wait until a couple days before the exam. So, having that in mind, and I think it's also really helpful and to have a pretty good idea of where you want to go with law school from the beginning, and try and chart out how you want to get there, because a lot of law schools they benefit from certain outcomes. Obviously they want folks to be employed, but they also have metrics based on income. And so I think can be easier to steer people toward some of those larger firms that might hire earlier on in the cycle. And I think one of the things to be aware of that can be a challenge is if you want to navigate away from that, you have to be, I think, pretty conscious of that intent and of figuring out the right way to get there, because there are paths that will lead you a little more easily, I guess I would say, into other outcomes.
It's great. Having clear eyes and being able to chart your own course, I think, is invaluable, not just for law school, but anybody who's about to navigate the rest of their 20s. Stephanie, what about you? What are some tips that you feel like you could pass on to another generation of law students? And you're a law professor, so you probably get these kinds of questions all the time, but what would you say to a group of undergrads?
So let me sort of separate these out into two different questions. One is maybe what I might say if you're trying to decide whether you want to go to law school or not. And then I'll also speak to some undergrads, like, what would I wish I had known the week before I was starting law school, so to speak. So for those who are thinking about, is the legal profession my calling? There are some reasons that I think a law degree is really great, and there are other reasons that I have seen lawyers become unhappy. So let's start with the unhappy reasons. If you want to go to law school because you think it's an easy ticket to a six-figure job, or because it sounds fancy and it will make your grandma feel happy when you go home at Thanksgiving and tell her that you are a lawyer. But in all seriousness, if you're doing it for some of those prestigious reasons, or because you think that it's going to be like Law and Order all the time, and then those might be reasons that will lead to you being unhappy. You might end up making six figures. I don't know, but in general, I would say this for any profession: the money alone is not going to make a profession or a life something that is rewarding for you, nor will the prestige. And very few legal careers are going to look like Law and Order all the time, though some will. But even if you're a prosecutor, there's a lot of time that you spend thinking hard about facts and the law and writing. So if we're going to the flip side, why might you enjoy law school? If you're a person who enjoys sort of debating ideas, looking at ideas from both sides of a picture, if you like reading or writing, even if you don't consider yourself a strong reader or writer right now, though, if you would be comfortable learning more about that. I've met some great lawyers who were engineers or chemists, and because they're so logical and they have a great work ethic, the writing will come, the specific type of legal writing. If you enjoy helping people and feeling like you want to be a voice for the voiceless and those that are more marginalized in society, there are great legal careers where you get to do that. And even if you just want to be more savvy about the world in which we live and a lot of the invisible levers that drive why companies do business the way that they do, and why a lot of requirements exist that we don't even think about, we take for granted, but you want to work in a different space, sometimes having a law degree can help in some of those overlapping areas. Like even if you're working at a company that's cutting edge and you're giving some advice for them about the way in which the quickly changing world is going to affect some of what they're doing. Those are some things to think about for law school. I'm really glad that I went. I thought I wanted to go when I was younger. I second guessed that decision when I went to college. And when I went to law school, one of my things that I was terrified about is, what if I hate this? What if I've been looking forward to going and it's terrible? So I was really excited when I liked it. As far as some advice I would give to students starting out their first week or their first day, there's going to be, I think, nothing more important for you in your law career than the mentors you develop. There's a lot of important factors, but I would say that is the single most important factor and variable in driving your success. What does that mean? It means that if your goal in law school is to be a wallflower and to never be noticed by professors or those who could be mentors to you, and never raise your hand in class and never go talk to them, you're going to be missing a lot of great opportunities, because professors or supervisors that you'll have at other jobs, and they often want to invest in you, be champions for you, once you give them the chance to get to know you, once you're willing to be vulnerable enough to show up and to stick your neck out and to try out answering a hypothetical in class, or go see what the professor says in their office hours. And those things can be scary, but it's really rewarding, and probably nothing more worth your time than to try and build relationships with people in your life that can become mentors for you. And one of the important ways you can do that is by trying to find ways to help them. So when I have students come to me and say, I really admire your career, I want to do the same thing, please help hand that to me on a silver platter. Like that's hard. That's hard to feel like I don't exactly know who you are, and I appreciate the interest, but like, you know, this is a hard way to immediately start this sort of relationship, as opposed to when I have students who come and say, you know, I admire your career, what you're doing. Can I do research for you? Can you tell me more about what you're working on? Can I take classes with you? I want to get to know you. And then, and as I get to know them and feel invested in them, it's a lot easier for me and more natural for me to, as I'm reading about job postings, send them an email and say, hey, I saw this come up. You should apply. You would be great. How can I help you? So that's one of the things that I think starting law students often don't realize and should really prioritize more, especially first generation law students, just don't really understand how important those relationships, I think, can be. The second biggest piece of advice I would give you, I mean, of course, try and get good grades, of course, work really hard. There's a lot of books and advice about how to try and do well in law school. Law School Confidential was one book that I read that was, I think, helpful. But I think the second biggest piece of advice is to try and be a good peer and colleague to your classmates. They will go on to be important references for you and important contacts in your legal profession. And it's just, you know, it's the right thing to do, and it will make law school a whole lot more fun and more meaningful for you if you're treating them with respect and dignity, as opposed to an obstacle on your way to compete, to you know, trample everybody in front of you and try and be the best that you can. You'll leave a sour taste in people's mouths, and you'll lose the chance to build relationships with really wonderful people.
That's great. Ben and I are friends that have been friends for a very long time because of our time in law school, and it will be one of those friendships that I value for time immemorial, and that comes from putting yourself out there and being able to say, I'm willing to network with others. I also want to emphasize for the audience, Stephanie was not paid before this interaction, so that list of things that she said that were bad reasons to go to law school, the fact that they were identical to mine is not because I told her to do that. I have a separate video that the students have watched at this point.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah,
great minds think alike.
my 10 reasons not to go to law school, and a lot of them include things like, you know, making grandma happy. That's not a reason to go to law school. So I'm glad we were on the same page on that. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today. This was a really great conversation. And students, if you have questions for these individuals, you can field them through me, and I'm happy to pass them along to both of them. But thank you both so much. You're both doing amazing work, and are admirable legal professionals. And any student would aspire to be more like the two of you. Thank you so much for joining me today.